The echo of rubber wraps hitting the bag dissolved into the empty gym, a deep rhythmic sound. Rhonda breathed deeply, focused, her muscles burned, but not from exhaustion, from self-control. Here in this corner, among the smell of old sweat, rubber, and metal racks, she always found peace. Finishing her workout, she threw one last series of sharp punches, then stopped, pulled off her gloves and stretched. Her breathing became steady. "Good work today, Rousey," nodded one of the trainers as he passed by. She responded with a slight nod, wasting no words. She didn't need praise. Discipline was her habit. Pain, her constant companion and control. Her choice. Her sports bag slung over her shoulder, the light tap of sneakers on the tiled floor, and she stepped into the night. The cold air hit her face sharply, forcing her to take a deeper breath. The city lived its nighttime life. The distant hum of cars, dark silhouettes of passers-by, diluted by the glow of signs and streetlights. She checked her phone, 1:34 a.m. A small 24-hour store was located next to the parking lot. It was late, but she couldn't shake off the feeling of hunger that followed every grueling workout. She decided to stop by. The door opened with a light jingle of the bell. The cold fluorescent light stung her eyes after the dark street. The store was almost empty. A man in a hoodie rummaged in the fridge with energy drinks. An old man at the register was counting his change. An ordinary place, an ordinary night. Rhonda slowly walked along the shelves, choosing what to take. A bottle of water, a protein bar. Simple, no fuss. She wasn't in a hurry, her movements were relaxed, but deep inside, something was already vibrating with alertness. This feeling didn't come immediately. At first it was a light irritation, an imperceptible discomfort. But soon it took shape, the sensation of being watched. She knew this feeling. It wasn't just someone looking. It was an intense, long, studying gaze. The kind that creeps under your skin, making your muscles tense instinctively and your pulse quicken slightly. She didn't turn her head. She just checked the reflection in the refrigerator glass. The man stood by the opposite wall between the shelves. Tall, broad, his dark gaze clung to her, sliding over her body, studying, weighing. He looked unkempt, but there was something too tense in his posture. Rhonda pretended not to notice and continued toward the checkout. She placed her items on the counter. The cashier, yawning, rang up her purchase. "Need a bag. Number." She quickly took her change, turned around and walked out of the store. The air outside no longer felt fresh. As soon as she stepped onto the parking lot, she saw him. He was standing next to her car. Not just standing, waiting. A broad back, clenched fists, a slight rocking motion from heel to toe. Everything about him told her one thing. He had made a decision. Rhonda didn't speed up her pace. She didn't slow it down. She knew this moment. It always starts like this. Something intangible, tense, almost palpable, hung in the air. The parking lot was deserted. Only the dim glow of streetlights cast long shadows on the cracked asphalt. The night air seemed thicker, heavier. Rhonda didn't change her pace or posture. Her stride remained just as confident as always. But inside, she had already assessed the situation. The man stood by her car, leaning against the hood. Not just a random passerby. He was there because he had been waiting for her. He knew she would come out. She had met men like him before. Rhonda never believed in coincidences, especially not these kinds. For a second, her gaze lingered on his face. 40, maybe a little older. Tall, massive, broad shoulders, hands with sinewy veins revealing strength. His careless outfit, a leather jacket, dark jeans, didn't hide his physical condition. This was a man accustomed to physical labor, or fighting. But what alarmed her most were his eyes. Dark, watchful, predatory. He wasn't looking at her like a person. He was looking at her the way one looks at a challenge. Rhonda didn't allow herself a single unnecessary emotion. She knew what he was searching for in her. Irritation, fear, doubt. She walked closer. He didn't move. "Nice night, huh?" He spoke first, his voice hoarse, with a hint of laziness, but there was a hidden challenge in it. Rhonda didn't respond. She stopped 2 steps away from him, just within the distance where she could react if something went wrong. "You train here often?" he continued, his lips curving into a slow smirk. She remained silent, but inside she analyzed every little detail. How he kept his hands in his pockets but slightly moved his fingers, as if preparing to do something. How his torso leaned forward slightly, his center of gravity shifted. How his breathing was slightly deeper than normal. He was ready. She didn't answer. She just pressed the button on her key fob, and her car beeped, unlocking the doors. His smirk widened. "Not much of a talker, huh?" She reached for the door handle, but he moved first. His hand darted toward the car frame, blocking her path. Not touching her, but looming, cutting off her movement. Now he was too close. Now he was testing her boundaries. She didn't step back. The silence between them thickened, became heavy. The man tilted his head slightly to the side, studying her face, and in his eyes for a moment flashed disappointment. He expected to see something different. Maybe fear, maybe nervousness, maybe a slight step back. But none of that happened. Ronda only slightly raised an eyebrow as if asking, "Are you done?" He exhaled almost mockingly, but in his gaze a new shadow appeared. Irritation. "You think you're special?" His voice dropped slightly, becoming rougher. "You think you can just ignore me?" She slowly turned her head, meeting his gaze directly for the first time. There was no fear in her eyes. And then something changed. She saw the tension in his jawline, saw how his fingers twitched in his pockets, saw how his breathing grew shorter. He realized he was losing control of the situation, and he hated it. "I'm talking to you," he said, his voice sharper now. "I'm just trying to be friendly." Rhonda still remained silent. She knew what was happening. First, words, then testing boundaries, then the attempt to dominate. He had already crossed the second stage, and now he was approaching the third. His hand tensed against the car frame. Now there was nothing between them except a few inches of space, and she knew what was coming next. The man was no longer smiling, his lips pressed into a thin line, his eyebrows slightly furrowed. The way he looked at Rhonda was no longer lazy or mocking. There was irritation in his eyes, irritation that was growing with every second. He didn't understand her. Everyone else always did. Women he encountered usually reacted predictably. Some avoided eye contact, looking away as if hoping he would lose interest. Others gave nervous smiles, agreeing with his words just to avoid provoking him. And some pretended they didn't care at all, but he could always feel their tension, catch the smallest hints of fear. Rhonda did none of that. She just stood there, calm, impenetrable, and it drove him insane. He hated her composure. He needed to break her. Rhonda felt his breathing change, the way his chest started rising a little more sharply, the way new tension appeared in his shoulders. She already knew what would happen next. He would raise his voice, try to intimidate her. And if that didn't work, he would step forward. He did. His body lunged toward her in a sharp movement, his broad hand striking her shoulder hard. It wasn't just a push, but something more, a deliberate act of dominance. He wanted to see her stumble, but she didn't stumble. Her body absorbed the impact as if it hadn't happened at all. He froze for a moment, a flicker of surprise in his eyes. This wasn't what he expected, but then his face twisted with anger again. "Are you deaf? I'm talking to you." The second shove was stronger. Rhonda could have stepped back, let him think he had won, but she didn't. Her hands remained at her sides, but now her entire body was tense, ready to respond. She caught the shift in his posture, the small but crucial signs, the clenching of his fists, the way he shifted his weight onto his toes, the tension in his shoulders. He was about to throw a punch, and she met it with absolute calm. The moment his hand shot toward her, she already knew how he moved. She didn't just dodge, she used his momentum. In one fluid motion, she caught his wrist, turned to the side, and let his own force work against him. A sharp pull, a snap of joints, a muffled groan of pain. Rhonda held his arm in an iron grip, twisting his wrist just enough to throw off his balance. He tried to pull away. She let him. But in that same second, His legs buckled because her movement was precise. She had used his own weight, his own attack. He lurched forward, losing his center, and she yanked him down. He crashed onto his knees. A loud, dull crack echoed in the night. His bones weren't broken, but he definitely felt pain. Ronda didn't need to say anything. Her actions had already spoken for her. He remained frozen, breathing heavily, his face twisted in frustration. It lasted only seconds, but it felt like an eternity. She could have broken his arm. She could have struck his throat, his jaw, ended it all in an instant. But she didn't. She simply stood there holding him in place until he understood one thing. He had lost. Ronda saw the moment it hit him, the realization, and that infuriated him even more. He was breathing heavily, his knees pressed against the asphalt, his hands trembling from the tension. He hunched over, trying to break free, and suddenly realized he couldn't. Ronda stood above him, firmly holding his wrist. She wasn't using her full strength, just enough to keep him restrained. She wasn't causing unnecessary pain, but she wasn't giving him room to escape either. In his eyes, she saw frustrated disbelief. He had never thought he would end up in this position. Not him, not in front of her. What are you? He tried to say something, but his voice shook. Ronda slightly loosened her grip but didn't let go. She saw what was happening. Everything in his body language told her he was torn between two desires. One, to break free, to strike, to take revenge. The other, to retreat, to convince himself that nothing had happened, that he had simply tripped. But retreating meant admitting defeat, and he wasn't the kind of man who accepted defeat. His breathing became unsteady, his face flushed, not from physical strain, but from anger and humiliation. He jerked again. Ronda was waiting for it. With one smooth motion, she turned slightly, shifting his center of gravity. His body followed her movement because physics dictated it. And then he was on the ground. This time, completely. He fell onto his back with a loud, dull thud. Asphalt is unforgiving, and his head smacked against the hard surface. Ronda didn't need to finish him off. She took a step back, breaking physical contact, but kept her eyes on him. He blinked a few times, his face twisting in pain and rage. She knew what was happening in his head. He was frantically trying to rethink what had just occurred, looking for an explanation, an excuse. He couldn't accept that she had won, so he started convincing himself that this didn't count. You... He tried to speak again, but his voice failed him, and then he heard the sounds. Shuffling, feet moving across the asphalt, soft murmurs. His eyes flickered to the side and he saw them. Witnesses. People stood by the 24-hour store. Someone had stopped mid-purchase and was now watching them. Someone else was holding up their phone. They had seen everything. And the worst part? They hadn't just seen, they had recorded it. The man exhaled sharply. Ronda noticed how his fist clenched. He couldn't handle this. He couldn't stand being seen like this. Lying on the ground, knocked down by a woman. Somewhere in the back of his mind, he knew he should stop. That right now he could just turn and walk away. But his pride wouldn't let him. He couldn't walk away because that would mean he had lost. And then he made his final mistake. His hands shot toward his pocket. Ronda didn't give him a chance. She moved faster than his mind could process. Her foot struck his forearm the very moment his fingers wrapped around the object. A knife. A metallic clatter echoed in the night. The crowd froze. Someone cursed. Someone was already dialing the police. But Ronda didn't take her eyes off him. Everything had changed now. The metallic clang of the knife hitting the hard asphalt echoed through the night parking lot like a gunshot. In that second, everything changed. Up until this moment, the man still had ways to back out. He could have turned around, walked away, convinced himself that it was just an unfortunate set of circumstances, that he hadn't really lost, that it was just a misunderstanding. But the knife lying on the ground erased all of those possibilities. This was no longer just a confrontation. This was now a threat. Ronda saw his eyes dart downward to the weapon, saw his fingers twitch involuntarily, as if his body hadn't yet realized that the fight was already over. But his mind had. Slowly, he lifted his gaze to meet hers. There was anger. There was humiliation. But deep beneath the layers of aggression, there was something else. Fear. He couldn't admit it. Couldn't accept that the woman he had tried to dominate was now standing in front of him, completely unshaken by his threats, his strength, or even his weapon. And the worst part, he had lost control of the situation. The crowd outside the store was no longer just a group of bystanders. Now they were witnesses. Someone was already on the phone, calling the police. Someone else was holding up their phone, recording everything. It dawned on him. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. He had wanted it to be different. For her to be afraid, for her to lash out first, for him to have an excuse. But she had given him nothing. And now he only had one option left, to attack again. His body reacted before his mind had fully formed the thought. He lunged forward. Ronda saw it coming before it even happened. She didn't wait. Her foot shot up, striking him squarely in the solar plexus. He choked on a breath, doubled over, his balance momentarily thrown off. But she didn't stop there. A swift motion, her hand caught his wrist, twisting his body. His back slammed against the hood of the car. A sharp turn, and he was face down on the asphalt, his arm locked behind him. This time he didn't move. Ronda stood over him, her breathing steady, her muscles tight, not from exhaustion, but from control. The crowd was buzzing. "Damn, did you get that on video?" A voice called from the store. "Yeah, I got everything." Somewhere in the distance, sirens wailed. He heard them, his face twisted with a mix of rage and realization. He knew it was over. Ronda knew he was still trying to come up with something, a lie, an excuse, a way to twist the situation, to flip the narrative in his favor. But he had no way out. He had been caught, and he knew it. The sirens grew louder, closing in. Red and blue lights flickered through the night, casting sharp flashes across the store walls, the cars, the pavement. Ronda took a step back, releasing her hold. The man beneath her remained on the ground, his chest rising and falling heavily. He no longer resisted. There was nowhere left to run. The police cars screeched to a stop at the edge of the parking lot, doors swinging open as several officers jumped out. Their movements were sharp, efficient. Their eyes scanned the scene, assessing the situation in seconds. The first to speak was a tall officer with a shaved head and a sharp, observant gaze. "Everyone, stay where you are!" His hand instinctively hovered near his holster, but as soon as he saw that the threat had already been neutralized, he relaxed slightly. Ronda calmly raised her hands to shoulder height, signaling that she wasn't a threat. The officer took a few steps forward, his eyes flicking between her and the man still lying on the ground. "What happened here?" he asked, his voice level, almost uninterested. Before Ronda could respond, someone from the crowd spoke up. "He attacked her. We got it all on camera." Several voices erupted at once, excited, talking over one another, waving their phones in the air. The officers exchanged looks. "Where's the weapon?" a female officer beside him asked. Ronda pointed to the knife still lying a few feet away. The officer pulled out an evidence bag, picked up the knife by the edge with a gloved hand, and silently sealed it away. The man on the ground groaned, finally trying to move. "Sit down," another officer ordered sternly, and he immediately froze. Ronda watched closely. She saw his lips twist in anger, his fingers clench into fists. He still wanted to twist this in his favor. He opened his mouth to speak, but was instantly cut off. "I wouldn't, buddy," the bald officer said. "It's all on video." The man snapped his mouth shut. His eyes slowly moved to the crowd, the glowing phone screens. The officers no longer just investigating, but making decisions. "You're under arrest for assault and threat with a deadly weapon," the officer said evenly, grabbing his wrists and locking them in handcuffs. Ronda saw his jaw tighten. "She attacked me first. It's all recorded," the officer interrupted him harshly. "Everything you say can and will be used against you in court." The man jerked slightly, but he no longer had the strength to fight. They hauled him up roughly by his arms. He turned to look at Ronda. You think you won?" His voice was hoarse, filled with hatred. "You think you're getting away with this?" Ronda stared directly at him, her expression unreadable. "I don't think," she said calmly. "I know." The officers marched him toward the squad car, shoved him inside, and slammed the door shut. The murmurs from the crowd began to die down. People exchanged whispers. Some were already uploading the footage online. A female officer stepped toward Ronda. "Are you okay?" she asked. Ronda nodded. "Did he hurt you?" "Number?" The officer studied her face for a few seconds, then nodded slowly. "We'll take statements and review the footage. If we need anything else, we'll be in touch." "Understood." The woman hesitated, as if she wanted to say something more, but then simply nodded and stepped away. Rhonda took a deep breath. The adrenaline was fading, leaving exhaustion in its place. She turned slowly and walked toward her car. She sat behind the wheel, resting her hands on it for a few moments, just sitting there, watching the side mirror, watching as the squad car carrying her attacker pulled out of the parking lot. He was in the past now, but this wasn't the first time, and it probably wouldn't be the last. Rhonda knew men like him didn't just disappear, but she also knew that she would never allow herself to be a victim. She turned the key in the ignition. The engine purred softly, the dashboard lights glowing faintly. Rhonda took a slow, deep breath and pulled out of the parking lot, leaving the night behind.